garrison at Vindolanda, the late, Marta can correct me if I'm wrong, the late 2nd century garrison at Vindolanda was the second cohort of Nervians. In the early 3rd century, it seems, they became the garrison at Epiacum near Alston. Ba, 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 ba. Okay, so thank you very much, Marta and Penny, and take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now, and you should be able to see my presentation. First of all, my name is Marta Alberti. I am the Deputy Director of Excavations at Vindolanda, and tuning in today, we've also got my colleague Penny Trichler, who is the site archaeologist at the site, and also the Activities Manager Coordinator. Today, I'm going to talk to you about Vindolanda and about the 2022 excavations. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour because we've got lots of ground to cover, and I try not to keep you from your dinners too long. So get your seatbelts on, and we're going to get started. So a little bit about Vindolanda. I'm sure most of you already know about the site, but Vindolanda is located on the Staingate Road, which is the line that you can see in blue on the image there. And Vindolanda is the green dot. The Staingate Road is a frontier before the frontier. It is a road, a rectilinear road, well, slightly bendy road that starts from the western coast and stretches into Corbridge. After Corbridge, and nobody's really quite sure where the road goes. There are hypotheses that it might follow all the way up into the Devil Causeway, but the trace of the Staingate Road has not been established east of Corbridge. So Vindolanda is sort of bang on in the middle of the Staingate Road, and that's why it was put there in 85 AD. So lots of people who visit the site ask us the question, why is Vindolanda in the dip of a saddle? Why is it not in a more dominant position? Why is it here? What made the first cohorts who established Vindolanda decide that that was the right place for it to go? Well, it was because of the persistence of the Staingate Road, and also because of the vast amount of natural resources that were available in the area, with particular regards to water. We've got a lovely stream and lots of springs that feed the site. So Vindolanda was occupied from 85 AD all the way to the well, the so-called abandonment of Roman Britain, or as I'd like to call it, the sort of slow but steady withdrawal of Roman authority from the northern frontier. We do have evidence, however, that people continued to live at Vindolanda well past AD 410, which is the traditional date for the withdrawal of Roman authority from Britain. The Vindolanda Trust runs a yearly excavation at the site. We have been digging continuously every summer since 1970, and we have been making really incredible discoveries. The site is one of the most important in Europe for its beautiful preservation of artifacts and the outstanding preservation of buildings as well. We operate using what is called a scheduled monument consent, which means a permission to excavate, despite the grounds being owned by the Vindolanda Charitable Trust. The site is scheduled, which means protected by the government, which means the Vindolanda Trust cannot just close their eyes and point at a random place on the map and decide that that's where they're digging. We require a scheduled monument consent. And rightly so. The scheduled monument consent is a permission to excavate in a certain area in order to answer to some research questions. So we need to come up with research questions that are useful to the wider Hadrian Wall community, and then we need to outline them in a scheduled monument consent application. We submit that application and we receive a yes or a no and any amendment from the Ministry of Sports, Media and Culture and their advisors, Historic England, in the Department of sort of Cultural Heritage and Archaeology. So since 2013, we have been exploring the area that is in the southernmost half of the site, so the part that's furthest from Hadrian's Wall. We've been looking through the many layers of occupation, and we've been using as our boundaries the stone walls of the last stone fort of Vindolanda, which was erected in AD 213. Over the past, feels like several years, but truly we started in 2019. We have been working on a scheduled monument consent called Understanding Communities and Identities. And we have been working both inside and outside the walls of the fort. But today I'm going to focus on the stuff that we did within the walls of the fort. Now, and this is something that I'm not going to quiz you about, but Alistair already shown an abundant knowledge of when talking about the second cohort of Nervians. Vindolanda is being occupied, as we said, from 85 AD all the way to 409 AD and after that as well. Which means that several garrisons have succeeded one another on the site. The first people to arrive at Vindolanda were the first cohorts of Tungrians from Belgium. They were followed by people from the Netherlands, from Spain, from France, and all manners of other people. So the northern frontier, and Vindolanda in particular, was a fairly multicultural place throughout its history. The periods that you see in the column in the middle indicate a demolition and reconstruction of the fort and extramural settlement. Each of the forts of Vindolanda, from number 1, starting in 85 AD, all the way to 410, had some accessory structures, and all the way into the 3rd century, there was an extramural settlement. So the fort walls and its contents were not the only thing on site. There was lots of civilian buildings all around the fort. So this is who lived here, and during the 2022 excavation, we explored the whole spectrum of occupation phases. So really, it's a great year to talk about because we covered quite a lot of ground. We covered all the way from the 4th century, from the 4th course of Gaul, until when in late September, we hit some period 1 structures from the first cohorts of Tungrians. Now, there's one thing that I want to show you that I like to call the Vindolanda paradox. So in black, you can see the outline of the last stone fort of Vindolanda, which was built in 213 and continued to be refurbished throughout its history all the way to 410 and after that in the sub-Roman and post-Roman period. We are excavating in this area here. This was the area in which we excavated between 2019 and we will continue to excavate in until 2023. Now you can see some colorful outlines as well. The Vindolanda paradox, in my own terms, is that you can be inside and outside a military fort at the same time. So for example, if I'm excavating here where my laser pointer is now, I am both inside period 1 timber fort, inside period 2, 3 timber forts, and inside period 4 and 5 timber forts. But if I move my cursor over here, I am inside only period 2 and 3 and period 4 and 5, while I am outside of the last stone fort and of the first timber fort. And if I move my cursor again, and I am there in the green, I'm outside everything but period 4 and 5's forts, inside instead the extramural settlements. So this is the Vindolanda paradox. You can be both inside and outside the fort at the same time. So this is how the 2022 excavation started. It's been an interesting few years for the Vindolanda Trust. In 2019, we excavated the sort of extramural settlement and the ditches of a 200 to 212 fortlet. And we were due to continue excavating there all the way to the end of 2019 and actually begin the excavation inside the fort in 2020. However, we made some interesting discoveries in the extramural settlement and in the ditches, namely that the Severn ditches that we were exploring sort of went underneath the tarmacked road that takes you from the west gate at Vindolanda, so from the visitor center down to the museum, and also that during the Antonine period, which is another period of very complex occupation at Vindolanda, there had been some sort of biblical flood event which basically hollowed out lots of the external defenses of the forts and turned them into a Grand Canyon looking like picture. So we hit the natural a lot faster than we thought we would, and we were finished early, which meant we could commence excavation in 2019 inside the fort, which in hindsight was a blessing, because in 2020, and we don't really talk about 2020, but in 2020, as you can imagine, we couldn't do very much as excavations were interrupted and everybody's life was sort of put on pause. So the excavation mainly consisted of member of staff, myself, my boss and director excavations, Dr. Andrew Burley, and Penny coming out on site and trying to further the research questions as much as possible with no volunteers. Now, I have taken this for granted, but I shouldn't have really. Vindolanda is a volunteer excavation, which means that there is professionals on site supervising everything and carefully working with lots and lots of volunteers to interpret the archaeology. We have over 300 volunteers each year. And this year, the volunteering subscription for 2023 has just been and gone on the 1st of November, and we were sold out of volunteering places within seconds. Penny can answer more questions about how to volunteer for the 2024 excavation season. For now, suffices to say that in 2020, we didn't have very much fun because we were lacking our lovely volunteers. However, in 2021, we caught up with ourselves, worked very, very hard, and this is how we left the site in September 2021. You can see a few bits and bobs here. You can see the corner of the fort. This is the southwestern corner of the fort. You can see some suspicious round structures. We'll talk about them later. And you can see the excavation. And we'll talk about the components of this excavation in a lot more detail, covering all the different parts and all the different layers of occupation that we've explored through the years, using the lens of the 2022 excavation to really zoom in on certain parts of the occupation. Now, it's interesting to see how this excavation started, because I'm now going to show you how it ended. So as you can see, there is quite a big difference. The pictures, before anybody asks, are taken with a drone. Penny also happens to be one of our drone pilots. Our drone is called Steve, fun fact, and he only flies when there is fair weather. And you can see in the little corner there is a little target. So the way we record the excavation, on top of the traditional hand recording and positioning objects and buildings with the total station, is through Steve. We send Steve up in the air. We position these lovely black and white targets. If you were to zoom in, you'd see that they have a little number. Then we mark the position, the coordinates of each target, and use the targets to create what you see now, which is an orthomosaic, which means it's a perfectly orthogonal picture of the site that you can zoom in quite in depth and produce a stone by stone traced map. So this is lovely and actually spares me quite a lot of standing around with a pencil under the rain, tracing stones. Long live technology. So this is how the excavation ended. You can see that there is quite a lot of changes. Let's compare them again. That's one. Lots of stone. It's quite a bleached image, isn't it? And that's two, our very, very dark area. Lots of changes. We'll go into details of them now. So we'll start with the 4th century occupation of the site and some bits that we identified in 2022 regarding the 4th century occupation of the site. This that you see in front of you is a cavalry barrack, a very traditional outline for a cavalry barrack, nice, long, rectangular. This area had been already excavated in 2017, but as you can see, it's already sort of consolidated here. So this wall was uncovered in 2017. So all it was left for us to do was to follow that wall inward and uncover the full extent of the building. Here you see again one of those little targets that I was telling you about. So this barrack has several rooms, and in each of the westernmost rooms, so the west is this way is the north, you have some hearths, some ovens, which indicates that most likely this part of the barrack was dedicated to human occupation, while the eastern part of the barrack was dedicated most likely to housing the horses and the mounts of the people who lived in this place. This little rectangular bit here is likely to have been a urine pit. Now, these survive much better at deeper layers. So they survive much better when they're buried under lots and lots of strata of archaeology. Here, you're quite high and quite close to the plow surface, so survival of the urine pits wasn't great. However, it's a really interesting building that appears to have been massively reused during the sub-Roman and post-Roman period, starting from 411 AD and ending up all the way to the Synod of Whitby. So a pretty interesting building. And this year we peeled apart all the various layers and identified the main components of this building. We had some fantastic find from our 4th century context. And you can see in the corner this really beautiful scabbard-shaped side. How does that even work? Right, so you imagine that you've got a sword and the sword goes in a leather sheath or in a leather scabbard. The leather scabbard has some iron and some copper alloy fittings, depending on how posh your leather scabbard is. This one was clearly quite nice, as one of the two sides of the leather scabbard had a lovely dolphin-shaped copper alloy decoration. Now, next door to that, you can see our fantastic volunteer, David. David would crucify me if I told you how many years he's been coming and how old he is, but I'm delighted to say that he is coming back next year to excavate. And look at what he's found. He's found the fossilized print of a shoe. You can see it zoomed in there. So again, this is a bit like the urine pit. The survival of these organic materials higher up in the strata that are closest to the oxygen is not excellent. So it's a pretty good find to have the full sole of the shoe almost imprinted onto these stones. Although I imagine that the person wearing that shoe wasn't particularly satisfied with the fact that they had left their entire sole onto the pavement. This beautiful bit here is an enameled belt buckle, absolutely fantastic. These bright, beautiful colors are characteristic of the late 3rd and early 4th century. So from the later strata, you can expect lots and lots of iron, and you can expect a fair amount of copper alloy in varying conditions from really great to really poor. And this is because these objects are very close to the plow zone, and they're also very close to the oxygen. We will see that as you delve deep under the layers of the 3rd and 4th century and of the Severan and of the Antonine occupation, and you reach down into the anaerobic layers of Vindolanda, finds preservation improves significantly. We had a pretty interesting find that I imagine some of you might have read about in the press. We're talking about this really beautiful, if I may, carved stone. You can see a picture of our volunteer, Dylan, there holding what we like to call the staff of recognition. This is the total station prism, which is used to record the precise position of every find we unearth on the Vindolanda excavation, so that during the winter we can create a distributional map of all our finds. So Dylan was excavating what you see outlined in blue, which is a trench, a cut. This cut was dated to the early 4th century, thanks to mostly stratigraphy. So stratigraphy is the relationship between different layers in the ground. We could see that this cut did not go through the wall of the barrack that I've outlined just before, but did go through 2 much earlier walls, one dating to 213 AD that I'm sort of pointing out right here, and one dating to roughly 160 to 200 AD down here. So this cut is likely to have been early 4th century in date, perhaps late 3rd. And the rubble that was filling it was quite angular. There was quite a lot of stones. And whilst flipping over one of these stones, our volunteer Dylan found this rather interesting inscription. Now, as this is recorded and also being put on YouTube, I will not be caught swearing. That would bring ill repute. But I don't think anybody needs my help in translating the words Secundinus Cacor. That's what it's saying. Secundinus is clearly a first name of someone, and Cacor is the most illuminated minds of epigraphy reckon, a badly spelled attribute, cacator. The phallus that you see here is very deeply carved. So we think that the phallus was already there when the inscription, the lettering was carved. So what is going on there? Because the phallus normally in Roman times is considered a very positive symbol. It's a symbol that sends away the evil eye. So what are we talking about? Why is an insult paired with a phallus? Well, it seems like someone turned a generally positive symbol into a very, very negative insult. So Secundinus must have been a fairly unpopular guy. And as you can see, the writing is quite clear and very well articulated and very well pressed into the stone. It's almost straight. I mean, if you don't give me guidelines, I write wonkier than that. So I like to think that more than one person passed the improvised artist and nodded his approval, saying, you know, well, Secundinus really deserves that one. We're not going to say anything. So this was a really great find because, apart from the amusement of, you know, a Willy, nobody really is too old for a Willy joke. We find a new aspect to 3rd and 4th century inscriptions. Normally, Alexander Meyer and Dr. Alex Mullins, who translated this together with help from the rest of the epigraphy community, they normally translate tombstones, altars, inscriptions. This is quite crude and brings it back to the everyday life of people at Vindolanda. It doesn't inform us of anything particularly important, rather than Secundinus was probably not the most popular person in the room. Now, going down under the cut and under the rubble and under our 4th century cavalry barrack, the outline of which you can still see over here, we have 3rd century occupation. So the 3rd century occupation starts in around 213 AD, and it's likely to be the last form of occupation of the site that sees a corresponding extramural settlement being present. In the late 3rd and early 4th century, the extramural settlement at Vindolanda is abandoned, and Dr. Andrew Burley in his thesis convincingly argues that most of the people from the extramural settlement would have transported their commerce and their daily lives within the boundaries of the fort wall. So 213 is the last strong stone building edification of the fort, and we have a rather lovely long narrow building which you can see circled in red. The building is likely to be a scola or an officers' club where officers were not only served their meals, but went to gamble and make non-official decisions that then clearly overspilled into official decisions. The building had 3 separate rooms, and there was quite a lot of ovens. You can even see one that was the most ginormous one here from the aerial photo. We did have a rather cute, tiny little one here, and we also discovered traces of timber partitions in this area over here. The material culture that we found on the flagged floor in between these ovens indicates high status. We've got lots and lots of beautiful objects such as brooches, hairpins, jewelry, and intaglios as well. And we've got lots and lots of pottery, such as this beautiful amphora stamp, indicating the consumption and storage of high quality foods. So rather lovely. Next door, you can see that we've got a similar building starting to appear there. We fully investigated this building during the 2022 excavation and found no traces of any ovens. So while the plan of the building is the same, the function was likely different. Our SMC, our Scheduled Monument Consent, focuses on the Severan occupation. The Severan occupation, you might remember from the graph, dates for Vindolanda between 200 AD and 213, with some indications that the time span in which the Severan fort was active might be even shorter than that. Now, you can see here a plan of the Severan fortlet and of its a very unusual accompanying settlement. You can see lots and lots of roundhouses. Now on this side, you've got your more traditional 213 onwards settlement. So here we have the extramural settlement and the fort, and the image is flipped during the Severan period when the fortlet here, this oddly shaped thing, is where the extramural settlement then ends up being. And the roundhouse settlement is where the fort plateau ends up being. So when you visit, you can see remains of the roundhouses in this area over here, and in this area over here, not to mention quite a few in this area over here, and a few in here as well. The 2 areas that you see highlighted were the ones that we proposed to investigate during our Scheduled Monument Consent. Area A1 is the area that I told you about, with the defensive ditches dating to the Severan and Antonine periods. Area A2 is what I've been talking about so far. So, the roundhouses usually look like this. They come in blocks of 10 and rows of 5. They're usually 4 meters in diameter and quite regular. They have cute little sandstone foundations. I say cute, and what I mean is soft and crumbly, so their consolidation is always quite tricky. Most of the time, a row of roundhouses faces north and the other faces south, but sometimes the roundhouses are built backing onto one another. So as you open the door of your roundhouse, you bang onto the back of the one next door. The inside of the roundhouses is fairly varied. You've got different room partitions and different type of floorings. However, their positioning is fairly standard. So this is why I say this is how the roundhouses look usually. And this is how the roundhouses looked in 2022. by a mysterious rule of fate, when you write a whole project investigating the presence and type of occupation within roundhouses, and you plan to do that for 3 whole years, you end up finding a lot less than you thought you would. However, we did supply for the not a lot of roundhouses with finding a very unusual one. Now, before I delve deeper into this subject, why is it important to understand the roundhouses a little bit better? A little bit of context for you. And this is prefaced by the fact that I am not a historian, and this is a very condensed version. So you should read this story for yourself, because it is absolutely amazing. The premise is that Septimius Severus, in the sort of early 3rd century, is conducting some intensive campaigning in the north of England and what is now Scotland. He has 2 sons, Gita and Caracalla, Caracalla of bathhouses in Rome fame. Gita and Caracalla are his natural-born sons, so they haven't got much to prove when it comes to being nominated emperors. They are not interested, in a very simplistic fashion, but they're not particularly, they don't stand to gain much from the war in the north. So when Septimius Severus dies, the 2 of them make a sharp return to Rome. Fast forward a few months, and the dominant brother, Caracalla, has Gita, his brother, murdered and all of his entourage, and performs something called damnatio memoriae, which is the condemnation of someone's memory, and basically means that Gita is deleted from history. All his depictions and all the inscriptions that mention his name are scratched out. If you're ever curious to see a Caracalla and Gita stone, I can warmly recommend the crypt of Hexham Abbey. So this is the backstory to the Severan period. And if I return a little bit backwards here, we can see that during the Severan period, the fort at Vindolanda is highly defended. These ditches are very, very wide, up to 4 meters wide. And when we excavated this rampart over here, we found our old map to be quite inaccurate, because the rampart is not this narrow. It turns out that the rampart is actually over 10 meters wide. So that's why the ditch, which we thought was within our excavation area, actually bumps along on the tarmacked road over here. So this is a heavily fortified fortlet consisting of rectilinear barracks and a commanding officer house here. The fortlet has in front of it all of these roundhouses, and there are a lot of theories about what these roundhouses might be. But I think the one that holds most current credence is that these roundhouses might be a place for settlers who lived north of the wall to be during the intensive campaigning that was being conducted by Septimius Severus. The myth that north of Hadrian's wall there is only enemies of Rome is best reserved for TV series like Game of Thrones. And in fact, even in Game of Thrones, you can see that some of the people who live north of the wall are actually benefiting from the presence of people south of the wall. So what an ideal place Vindolanda is to host what modern politicians would call cushion states. People who are friendly to you, people who benefit from your presence there, people who you can put back in place once you're finished wreaking havoc with the north. Again, this is a very simplistic summary of what was going on in the Severan period in the northern frontier. So I can fully recommend a number of resources that you can read up on. It's a fascinating, if a bit gruesome story. However, the fact that these might be prisoners' hut or a prison camp or a labor camp ties in well with the fact that once the war ended, these were quite thoroughly demolished, and any trace of any help being offered to the people north of the wall was swiftly erased. So returning to our excavation in 2022, We did find some roundhouses, and the regular ones can be seen highlighted in red here. The fact that they were often cut by other bits and bobs tells us that perhaps the occupation of the roundhouses was just not one brush stroke, but there was a multi-phase occupation of these roundhouses, or their lifespan was fairly short and they were replaced by something else. The thing that I wanted to highlight, however, is this roundhouse over here. It stands in isolation with two paths, a stone line leading to it, and a refuse pit over here. There is also a deep gully over here, which has been interpreted as the discharge gully for a latrine. It's really interesting that this roundhouse stands in isolation about 6 meters from its closest contemporary and has all these extra features. The other thing that this roundhouse has is a lot of material culture, which we don't see in other roundhouses. So for example, this duck brooch that you see over here is actually more of a duck hinge, beautiful and decorative, found in this refuse pit, together with a twisted bracelet, a couple of knife blades, lots of worked bone, and in general, quite a bit of material culture that's fairly unusual for the time. Now, why have I got this silver duck brooch here? This was found during the 2018 excavations, and it's also from the Severn period, but discarded in the ditch. So it's two completely different approaches to the theme of the duck. This is a Trumpeter Munster solid silver brooch. This one is a much more stylized hinge with sort of fairly degraded copper alloy. Two completely different takes, one very fort-centered, discarded in the Severn ditch, and one very roundhouse-centered. All very interesting. You can learn more about Trumpeter Munster brooches and other Celtic motifs by looking at the great collections of the National Museum of Scotland. Now, going down into history, we then reach the Antonine period at Vindolanda, which is a complex period dating between 140 and 200 AD. During this time, the fort and its building were reconstructed at least 3 times. The first time around, the fort was constructed in timber, then a stone annex was added, and finally the whole fort and annex were refurbished with soft yellow sandstone. Where have we heard soft yellow sandstone before? Of course, we've heard it in the roundhouses. So this is one of the great instances of recycling occurring at Roman Vindolanda. We actually excavated in 2016 a part of the Antonine fort wall, which had been systematically robbed out of its facing stones in order to construct the later roundhouses. So here you can see an interesting plan of where the buildings would have been during the Antonine period. We've got 2 large foundations for what looks like a gate. These square here are column bases or plinths, and these are much smaller ones. And this is an interesting outline because over here you can see the traditional shape of an infantry barrack with the centurion apartment at its terminus, an added veranda, and then an added veranda onto the veranda just over here. So this was really interesting. I quite like the Antonine period, although I do admit it's very complicated and mind-boggling. It does offer some astounding finds as the preservation improves and you head down into the deeper layers of Vindolanda. This beautiful owl pot is likely to be ritual, and what you can't see because it's before of its cleaning is that it's got a little triangular beak and the eyes are hollow throughout. So once the contents were removed, the eyes were hollow. This fantastic bead is a rather lovely turquoise glass bead with cordons in. Now, I recently went and attended a talk by Martin Goldberg of the National Museum of Scotland about the Galloway hoard, and what he talked about was what happens to these amazing beads and how they get repurposed in the hoard. That talk was recorded by the Insight Lecture series of Newcastle University. So if you fancy having a look at that, I can only recommend it. And then we've got these rather lovely Cupid here. Unfortunately, his face hasn't survived quite so well, but he's clearly identifiable by his wings and by the typical pose that he assumes, that is turned 3/4, and frankly, showcasing its bottom. The carved pillars that I was mentioning to you earlier are incredibly nice. You can see here that they were uncovered during the 2022 excavation season, but this is not the first time we saw them. Very similar blocks of soft sandstone were uncovered in 2005 and 2006 in the extramural settlement excavation in front of something called a temple tomb. So almost a mausoleum. And this was excavated, and the finds within it gave it a terminus postquem, which is fancy Latin for it cannot have been any earlier than AD 161. So interesting, these are probably not in the first phase of the Antonine occupation. They date more likely to the second phase, the phase in which you had a little bit of timber and a little bit of stone. Now, once we go underneath the Antonine layers of the site, we reach the anaerobic excavation. The term anaerobic means oxygen-free. And oxygen-free in, again, a really simplistic description, means that the fuel that the bacteria need to start eating organic material is significantly reduced. It's not zero, so the bacteria do have a little bit of eating to do, but it's really slowed down. And that's because all of these forts and all of these garrisons that have come one after the other have buried the forts that were built by the previous garrisons. So you have some incredible preservation in the deeper layers. And you can see here a wattle and daub fence, which has been reinforced with a red deer antler. Inside this fence, we also found all sorts of fancy junk, including a rather lovely wooden turned inkwell and lots of shoes. That's the inkwell over here. This one is a rather lovely iron knife, which was found still within its sheath. So at the sort of middle of the season, we faced some trouble because climate change is seriously affecting the precipitations in our region. You might have noticed that we have gone from having a stable level of moisture during our summers with quite a lot of drizzle stably coming down, to having long dry spells followed by bucket loads of water. So in the middle of the excavation, we had to pause the investigation of our anaerobic layers because it wasn't raining enough. There wasn't enough moisture in the air and there wasn't enough moisture in the ground. So these beautiful precious layers containing important vital information such as the Vindolanda tablets were drying up as soon as we opened them. So we had to delay the excavation of the anaerobic materials, which resulted in a flurry of activity towards the end of the season. And as part of the activity, you can see here myself and Tanya Romankiewicz from Edinburgh University and Fraser Hunter from the National Museum of Scotland, excavating a lovely example of a complete wooden spade. Unfortunately, our curator and conservators inform us that the spade was put in the ground already equipped with a healthy amount of wood rot. So its conservation is going to last very, very long, and it's going to be a long while before we can display it to the public. I am reliably informed I will probably turn 40. Now, the other thing that we found in the anaerobic layers and that we had a press release about is this beautiful cornu. So a cornu is a G-shaped musical instrument, and this is truly just the mouthpiece of the instrument. Now, this is quite interesting because not very many of these have been found. In fact, I think this is the second one to come from anywhere in Roman Britain over the last 50 years. This was found on the floor of a Hadrianic workshop, meaning that it was probably meant to be recycled, and that's how it's come back to us. Earlier in the summer, we had a special event in which we invited two performers to play for us the replicas of the cornu and the carnyx. The carnyx is the screaming instrument shaped like a dragon that you are all familiar with from pop culture references, no doubt. But what I wanted to sort of show you here is the beautiful sound of the cornu. So I'm going to try and play this for you, and I do hope it works because it's rather lovely. I've put the laser pointer on, and now I don't know how to take it off. There we go. So I think that was incredible, and it reminds us that the past wasn't a silent place and that music would have been played there. And just because we don't know how it sounds like, it doesn't mean that it wasn't there. In fact, the cornu was likely a very important aspect of the military life, and it would have been heard sounding during military exercises, during practices. It would have helped directing maneuvers. So it is really amazing to have found such an example, and the possibilities that it opens for research into musical instruments are really incredible. So it was a fantastic find from the 2022 excavation. And then the other thing that we found, of course, and I say of course, but it's not to be taken for granted, was some of the Vindolanda tablets. The Vindolanda tablets are what made the site initially world famous in the 1970s when they were first excavated. They are thin pieces of wood, generally soft wood, but here you can see a dark example which is made of oak just over here. And there is two types of tablets. There is the stylus tablets, which are much thicker and would have contained a bed of beeswax onto which messages would have been inscribed and would have then been deleted when the use for them had been past. And this example over here, which is an ink tablet. This year we found more ink tablets than stylus tablets, and we did pass the 10 mark, which was our bet with ourselves. Some of them are immediately legible. You can see that here you are able to read some of the words. They are written in cursive and the ink is very faint. So of course it takes a certain amount of time to translate them, which means that the tablets that we have found this year will not be ready for translation for another little while. But you can see the ones that we found in 2017 on display. And this one down here is one of my favorite. It is written by a gentleman called Masculus, which in Latin means male. So someone must have been extremely excited to finally have had a boy. What I'm talking about here is the recurrence of certain people. So we know Masculus from other tablets, and we know another person called Tagomas from other tablets. So we're starting to see the recurrence of names and the recurrence of certain characters, and we can almost write a biography of the people that lived at Vindolanda. It's really incredible, and what it does is it offers insights into the everyday life of the people on the northern frontier that other material culture, buildings just cannot fill. So we can tell by a building and by its floor plan what sort of activities might have taken place in it. That information is then complemented by bulk finds such as pottery and bone, and by small finds such as beads, brooches, things like that. However, all of these objects can never tell us how the people of Vindolanda felt about one another, about life on the frontier, about their daily mundane tasks, about the shopping list that they had to make. And that's what these tablets tell us. So I want to conclude on an appeal. These incredible snippets of our pasts are constantly put in danger by things like climate change. At the Vindolanda Trust, we're paying a lot of attention to the ethics of human intervention and of climate change onto archaeology and heritage. We have in the pipeline another project which we have been applying for funding for to the National Lottery Fund. And we are awaiting a decision on that project at the end of this month. But should the project go ahead, it will look at our sister site at the Roman Army Museum and the site of Magna and Carvoren, which is mentioned at the beginning of this talk. And it will look at investigating the effects of climate change on the aerobic and anaerobic deposits on site. We're building in a robust program of science as well, with meteorological probes and all sorts of measurements of various factors. And we continue to excavate year in, year out, thanks to the incredible support of our volunteer community and of people like yourself who listen to our outreach talks and hopefully come and visit the site. So I'm going to conclude here because I think I've used up my time, and I am going to invite any questions for myself and for my colleague Penny, and I hope that I will see you on site next spring. Our 2023 excavation begins in earnest in April. Thank you very much.